Hi everyone, this is Britton here. If you're new to this group, welcome. Happy to have you. My name is Britton LaTulip. I am the author of the Art of Raising Children for Greatness series and the president of Blue Manners Online Academy. For those of you who don't know, this Art of Raising Children for Greatness series is going to be a 5-book series. 2 books are out. One is coming out. In fact, I have it right here, the hard copy in my hand. It's coming out this month. And then 2 more are coming. The first book was Revealing School. That was where I convinced you that the school is a bad place to educate your children, even private schools, but mostly public schools, and basically reveal all the harmful things that go on in the public school system. And it's not just important if you're already homeschooling. It's still an important book because there's so much you need to know about what not to do, because so many homeschoolers, they bring public school right into their own homes and they start duplicating all of the problems that the public schools have. The next book was really a little more positive, uplifting. It's showing you what you should do. That is education. And then the third book, probably the most important book I've written so far, is character. When it comes to an elite education, character is king. And I'm going to show you how to give your kids an elite education and prepare their character for greatness in the next book. And then we have 2 more coming. And I'm not going to talk about those right now. Tonight, what I want to talk about is coming of age ceremonies and the importance and what they mean and when they should happen. And this is because we had our first teenager come of age, our first child come of age just this past weekend. Our oldest daughter turned 13. So that's traditionally, and we'll get into that in just a second, the age that everybody recognizes young people are coming of age, or they're becoming adults, passing on from childhood into adulthood. And in the 4th book, which will be released, hopefully next year, after we get out character, we're going to we talk about power. That's what that book's about, power. And one of the things that gives your children powerful, right, is tradition. And one of those traditions, is rite of passages. It's really important to have those rite of passages when kids know they don't kind of wander aimlessly into adulthood, but they know, no, on this day, I transitioned. I'm now looked at by my community, which not the greater community, sadly, but at least my family. They recognize that I'm an adult. I'm a contributing member of the family. And again, we'll get into that in just a second, what it means. So, coming to the age ceremonies, right now, the only really community that really is still embracing this, I should say, is the Jewish community. Many of them still have what's called a bat mitzvah for girls or a bar mitzvah for the boys. And that is the age of 13. We'll talk about in just a second why it was 13. But what that recognizes in their community, it's a recognition that child has transitioned into adulthood. Many other cultures throughout all of civilization have these coming-of-age ceremonies right about the age of 13. In other traditions, in the Jewish tradition, you read from the Torah. You have a ceremony where you recognize as an adult. You're responsible for knowing the law, and you're able to read out loud publicly from the sacred texts in the temple, is what I get, or in the synagogue. So you're seen as an adult. That's kind of their traditional coming-of-age ceremony. Others have, usually it's a conquest of courage. Maybe they have their sons go out and hunt a lion, or there's this one culture, I think it's in like Indonesia or something like that. It's one of those islands over there. They actually jump from a huge tower. It's a free dive onto the land, but the elders tie up their feet with these vines that kind of stretch, and it's kind of like bungee jumping, and it should stop you right before you hit the ground and bring you back up. And that's where they signify that they have the courage to jump. Secondly, they're putting their trust in their elders' hands who've rigged these vines to protect them. And there's a whole bunch that I could go through. There's the tribe in Hamar, and they have the men stripped down naked, and they run across the back of 12 bulls. And you think, well, that's kind of a very strange. And they do this in front of the community with both men and women present. It's not how I would have my coming-of-age ceremony, but it was important because then the young man is showing that he's not ashamed. He can stand in front of his whole community completely bare. And that's kind of his showing his courage, that he's bearing it all in front of his community, literally, but he's not ashamed. He can stand on his own 2 feet now as a man. That's a stranger one. So we've kind of invented our own for our child. And what our coming-of-age ceremony looked like was we had a party. It's important because we don't really usually do birthday parties. We just have something small. We have a little bit of cake and ice cream at our house, maybe a few presents, but we don't do this big thing and invite lots of people. So we only do that for the 13th birthday. So this is very special. And then we go all out. We rented a big facility. We bought a special cake. We put some money into this because it is that one birthday that we're going to celebrate. I want my daughter, actually all of my kids, they come in age, to be just like a wedding, to be able to look back and reflect and remember that day. It was so memorable. It was so fun. It was so exciting. It was monumental. So they can look back and say, yeah, I remember that day when I became an adult in the eyes of my family and hopefully in the eyes of my community. And then for our daughter, what we did is we gave her a promise ring. Hopefully you know what that is, but it's basically that you're promising to save yourself for your husband. And when you get the engagement ring or the wedding ring, you would take that off, give the promise ring to your fiance, and know that you've saved yourself for marriage. So that was one of the things we did. The other thing that we did, similar to the Jewish ceremony or the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah, is we had our daughter say the public prayer. She just did the Lord's Prayer publicly, led us before we started eating, and that was to kind of symbolize that she is also a leader in the faith, and she can speak publicly like an adult. Usually you don't have the kids get up in front of a bunch of people and make a statement or say the prayer. It usually goes to one of the older people, right? So by doing that, we're saying that she's also a faith leader, and she's one of the adults, able to speak in the council, let's say, of adults, and kind of lead the ceremony. So those were the two traditions that we did besides the party. We might add those or change those as time goes on, but this is our first one. So that's what we did. Okay, now the age. This is what's controversial. It didn't used to be. Throughout history, everybody recognized that a child basically passes into adulthood around the age of 13. That's pretty much all of traditional history. And it seems to be supported, whether you believe in evolution or creation, it seems to be supported by the biological function. That's the age that, another fly, that's the age that children begin to pass through puberty. And so whether they're mentally, and we'll talk about that in a second, mentally capable of adulthood, their body is passing through into adulthood and they're able to reproduce. And so if you believe that God created human beings for whatever reason, if they were just children, it seems strange that he would give them that biological function. And that's going to be real controversial, and we'll get into that in a second, because in our culture, we think of them as children until they're 18, and now sometimes even 21. But they have the biological function to reproduce at the age of 13. That was by God's design, or you could say that was nature's design through evolution. I think it was God's design. And so we're recognizing that, and that was through all of history. It wasn't until the 1880s, 1860s, there's a guy named G. Stanley Hall. I talk about that in Revealing School, Inventing Adolescence. And he's actually, it's interesting, he's one of the first children to undergo forced compulsory public education. Meaning in Massachusetts, they've had schools since the beginning of America's founding, but usually the schools were just small. They were grammar schools. You went voluntarily, and many times you just went for the summer a little bit, just to learn how to read and write, and they actually did a pretty high level in a very short period of time. But in Massachusetts, around the 1850s, they passed a compulsorily, I can't even say it today, I'm struggling. I'm just going to say it, mandatory public schooling for kids. So George Stanley Hall is one of the first kids to go through mandatory public school, not year-round, but yeah, basically year-round like we have, except for the summers, right? And he notices something. He says, for whatever reason, these teenagers, they seem to kind of be in between children and adults. They have some of these impulses, but they're very hormonal, they're very aggressive, they're very violent and disrespectful. So they're acting in some ways like an adult, like they have adult impulses and hormones, but they're still childish, and they're kind of in this in-between stage. And he's going to actually attribute this to evolution. I was invited by friends, bar mitzvah. It was really impacted me in some ways, but since... Okay, so yeah. So he's actually going to tie this into evolution. So evolution right now is coming on the scene in a big way in educational psychology and this idea of like social engineering. That everybody's excited. They've decided that we're nothing but biological machines, basically, and we can be programmed. Everybody's excited about public education. They think it's going to be utopia, that they're going to get these children away from their ignorant parents, and the experts are going to start programming children. And a lot of this is based also on the evolutionary theory that we're basically biological machines, and everything can be kind of tied back to a biological impulse. And so what they used to believe, and it's silly, and some people, it was crazy. I was going through the Special Forces qualification course down in Fort Bragg, and there was this guy from West Point, and he was talking about how evolution's true and how they're teaching it at West Point, and there's proof of it because you go through all the evolutionary stages. You start off as like an amoeba, and then you turn into like a fish or like a tadpole, and it's really silly. They're actually still teaching that. That was just like 20 years ago, but that used to be the belief that you went through all the evolutionary process, and you basically turn into like this little fish, this little tadpole. And they used to think you had gills, but actually now we know with science, those are actually your ear canals. You're always a human being. You don't go through those stages. But then they believe that you became a baby. You were basically like a chimpanzee. And this was huge advocacy for abortion too. They said, well, you're just basically an animal, and we kill animals. So what's the difference? Killing an unborn baby or even a born baby. They only have the IQ of a child. There was even a guy, I think he's a Princeton, I think he's the head of like ethics at Princeton University now. And he said the same thing basically. There's really nothing wrong with even killing a born baby up to maybe 6 months because they're basically just like the intelligence of a monkey or maybe even a dog or something like that. But then they said, okay, what is adolescence? They said, well, after you go through puberty, sorry, I lost my voice. There's lots of yelling, playing games at this party over the weekend. So there we go. So they said basically, you go through puberty and then you enter the stage of adolescence, which is this Neanderthal stage. That's Neanderthal. You're not fully human yet. You're kind of like a grunting Neanderthal. You're led just by your impulses, your hunger, your sexual appetite. You're prone to violence, and your brain hasn't developed completely. And then you go into somewhere about 18 to 21, you start to cross over and become a real fully human being. And so with that, they use that justification to extend public education. They said, well, the education shouldn't stop. You're still a child until maybe 18 or 21 years old. So it actually gave the U.S. government the legal right to contain you because you're not fully an adult yet. Whereas throughout history, you'd been an adult about 13 years old. They can now say, no, we're going to keep you in school until you're 18. So they're getting to educate what traditionally had been adults, incarcerate and educate adults now, if tradition is right. That was the theory. That basically, and you'll hear this all the time. Their brain's still developing. They're not responsible for their outcomes. You'll see 16-year-olds commit the most heinous adult crimes, and they're seen as, well, their brains are undeveloped. They need to get tried as an adolescent or a teen or a minor because they're not like adults. Okay, that contrasts with all of history, and it contrasts with biology. Both of biology and historical tradition says that you transition into adulthood at about the age of 13. In fact, they think that Mother Mary was probably about 13 years old when she conceived Jesus. So that is the tradition, and that's why we picked the age 13. The Jewish tradition, they can still continue to treat their children as adults. They cross into that at 13. Okay, so what does that mean? Because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, my 13-year-old isn't ready to go out into the world and get a job, get married and stuff. They're still developing. Part of that is our culture, that we've actually dumbed kids down. So we don't treat them like adults. We baby them. We kind of help them live in this kind of fantasy Neverland. If you've read this book, Neverland, we've extended childhood. So that's partly our fault. And they're adults now, 20 years old, 30 years old, and they're still acting like children. They're playing little video games. They don't know how to control their spending. They don't have any sort of commitment. They're basically like that traditional adolescence. It's being extended. But it doesn't mean that when they turn 13 that they can do whatever they want. So with our daughter, people are asking that, well, what does that mean? If she turns 13, can she do whatever she wants? She can go date. She can watch whatever she wants to do. Absolutely not. She's still under our authority. And again, if we go back to the traditions, a child was always under their parents' authority until the parent died, historically. If you look back in the Bible with the priest Eli was condemned by God and cursed. His family was cursed by God because his adult sons were misbehaving in the temple and he wasn't disciplining them. So God in the Old Testament still sees you as a parent responsible for your children well into adulthood. So just because they come 13, it doesn't mean that they can do whatever the heck they want. Like in our society, when we think of a kid becoming an adult, 18, it's hands off. They have total freedom. They can do whatever they want. And we're just supposed to kind of sit by and let that happen. Recently, there was a a story. Steven Spielberg, the famous film director, one of his daughters decided she wanted to go into the adult film industry. And he said, well, there's nothing I can kind of do. And a lot of people said, well, they should support that. It's her choice. It's her life. That is the time when parents are supposed to step in and exert their authority and say, absolutely not. It doesn't mean we micromanage our kids for the rest of their lives. I tell my kids, you're always free to make good choices. So, here's the bedtime. Here's the latest you can stay up. If you want to go to bed earlier, absolutely. Here's the minimum chores. If you want to do more, you have that right, that freedom. They always have that. But it doesn't mean that they can do whatever they want. I'll always be their dad. And traditionally, it's a little bit different for boys and girls. Traditionally, girls are under their parents' authority until they marry, and then they go under the husband's family's authority, which didn't mean they were under their husband's authority, but they're also under that family's authority. They took on that name, and there was that family hierarchy. The sons always remained under the authority of their father. Now, again, that doesn't mean I micromanage them. In big decisions like who they marry, the father has the final say. The father and the mother has the final say, and that's so important these days. You see record high divorce rates. Kids are just going up. They're all Twitter-pated, and they meet this cute boy in college, and they think they're ready for marriage. Parents need to be involved in those decisions. If my son decided he wanted to leave his wife and children for another woman, that's a time when I step in and exert my fatherly authority and say, I forbid it. Now, in our society, he's 18 years old. He can tell me to pound sand. I can't force him in our society, but he'll know that he has defied his father. He's dishonored and disobeyed his father. And I think if you raise your children right, that's going to be a heavy thing. If you raise your children right, they're going to want to obey their parents and honor their parents even after they're gone. Now, it doesn't mean I micromanage him and tell him where he has to live and what time he has to go to bed and how to run his family. I'm going to give him autonomy to make good decisions. It's really only I step in and exert my parental authority when they need it. Okay? So that's what that means. Is my daughter free to do whatever she wants? Absolutely not. She's still under authority. Here's what does happen. She's an adult in our family now. When we have councils, she's a part of that. If we wanted to talk about moving, she'd be a part of that. She knows our family finances. She knows how much equity we have in our homes. She knows our family's wealth. She is come into the business now, so she's actually working for Blue Manor Academy. She's doing some minor things now, but we're going to work her up, and she's going to become an active member or worker for Blue Manor Academy. So she is one of the adults now. When it comes to dating, our kids don't date, period. She's not allowed to even think about dating until she's 16. And then we will start maybe courting. And what courting means is just that it's father-mother approved and it's well chaperoned. And that's, I guess, the difference is the girl doesn't get to pick whatever cute guy she wants and then get into his car and go out into the night and we just cross our fingers. That'll never happen. And then when my daughter, whether she's 21 or 24, she'll hopefully just live under my roof. That's my goal. And then she'll get married and she'll go, sadly, under somebody else's authority. That's what the father says. I give this daughter away. So he's letting go of his authority, and he'll still be a father, a friend, but she'll be under a different authority. The sons, they'll always be under the father's authority in my world. And I know that sounds crazy, and you think, oh, how can that happen? I know it'll happen. I don't believe that my sons will ever dishonor me or disobey me. They trust my judgment. Hopefully, that'll continue. And I'm certainly not going to be a tyrant. I want them to take charge. I want them to be the leaders of their homes. I want them to have good things. I'm really just there when things get out of control or they need some of that authority. And we think of authority and submission and stuff like that as a bad thing. We love liberty. It's all about being the freedom and not being told what to do and our rights and stuff like that. But actually, authority, we'll talk about that actually in this next book on character, the power of authority. It's really funny. People are going into adulthood and they've rejected their parents' authority, and their parents don't exert any authority. They don't even know that they should. They're 18 years old. They think they got all figured out, and then they realize, I need somebody to take charge of my life. It's out of control. I need some guidance. And they're going out and paying money, hiring life coaches. Or they can't lose weight, so they go to the gym and they pay a personal trainer to train them. Authority is good. We are paying people to exert authority over us because we know that we need that. We can accomplish more with authority. So that's actually a benefit that my sons and my daughters will have for the rest of their life. They'll always have a father, an authoritative figure that they can look to for guidance. And if need be, I can step in with authority and say, no, you can't do this. I forbid it. if it needs to happen, if that makes sense. So this is not like a tyrannical thing. It's actually very liberating to be under somebody's authority. So much of the time, sometimes I wish I had that. I'm like, oh, if somebody get me up or push me a little bit, or oh, I wish somebody would, you know what I mean? Some sort of authority figure, a father figure to continue to guide you throughout your life is important. Okay, that's basically it. Oh, I want to talk about one other thing. This is interesting. I meant to mention this earlier. There's a common Bible verse. It confuses people today. I think I've talked about this before. But in the Old Testament, it says if you have a rebellious son, take him before the elders, and if with their consent, you could stone this guy to death. And we tend to think, again, because of authority, we think, well, if you have authority over a rebellious son that you have authority over, it must be a child, because in our mind, that's the only authority we have. If the kid's 18, he can tell us to pound sand, he's doing his own thing. So we think, man, these people are going to stone their own little babies, children. This is horrible. I remember being told that when I was a kid, that you could have been stoned. And I was probably like 11 years old or something. And I was thinking, man, that is pretty harsh, the Old Testament. But actually, that's a cultural misunderstanding. It goes back to the tradition that the father at the time, the patriarch, was like the king of his castle. They didn't have this big overarching government. You lived out in the middle of nowhere. You had, a few families, maybe you were shepherds, and somebody was in charge, and that it was the patriarch of the family. Sometimes these sons, when they became adults, maybe 20, 30 years old, their father's aging now, he's older, he's weak, they would try to rebel and overthrow the father. And then if it got so bad, the father had the ability to exert capital punishment over his son. Now, the funny thing is, in the Old Testament, it's actually kind of a limit on that power by saying you have to take him before the elders. You can't just execute this on your own. But that's what that's talking about. It's talking about the parental authority, not of executing a little child, but it's showing that even as adults, a 30, 40-year-old adult back then, 30, 40-year-old man was still supposed to submit to his father. And they had stronger, families back then. So that's kind of what we're doing, guys. That's what it means to us. I highly recommend you have at least the ceremony in that tradition. It's so important for you to welcome your kids into the world as an adult, so they can start to sit at the council, see how adults behave, and you can show them what adulthood is. The worst thing that can happen to you is you let your kid turn 18 and you say, well, you're on your own. You're totally free. You can do whatever you want. And then at 18 years old, they finally get a taste of freedom. They go off to college and they think, I can do whatever I want. I'm only accountable to myself. I'm in charge. If my kids go to college, they need to know that dad's still in charge. Dad's still their father. He still exerts authority. They should behave themselves. But then these kids go out into the world, all these other 18-year-olds, and they try out adulthood on their own, and they start to adopt the bad practices that their peers had. And adulthood ends up being just doing the things that were forbidden, going to adult stores, watching adult shows, drinking adult drinks. And that's kind of the American version of adulthood, what it means. You can smoke, you can drink, you can curse, you can watch whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. That's a really sad way to introduce your children to adulthood. So I want my kids to become adults under my roof at 13 years old, and then they can see, okay, even though you're an adult, there's still limits. Here's how we behave. Here's what adulthood means. Here's the burden of adulthood. It's not just a freedom thing, guys. It's a burden of leadership now. You're an adult. You represent this family. You are part of our family's reputation. Let's maintain it. Let's behave yourself. That's what adulthood is to me. So anyway, I know it's a different approach. I write about this in the next book. Like I said, on Power, that's coming out. I do a lot better when I write. I'm not a great public speaker, as you could probably see, but I think I do a great job setting this up, and I'll show the importance of it in the book. So anyway, just stay tuned. I guess that's all I have. If you guys have any questions, just leave them below. I'll try to ask that. You guys' questions always come to the front. And then look out for Character. Character is coming. It's going to be an incredible book. It's a lot thicker than the education book. But if you haven't read Education, these books build on themselves. I highly recommend it's a short, quick read. I highly recommend you get that, read that, and then Character is going to fit right on top of that. And then we're going to keep building. And the next book will be Power. So it'll be exciting. All right, guys. Thank you so much. We will see you next week.